I'm welcoming you to the June 2023 webinar. And this webinar that I'm presenting on is IEP facilitation on the district level. So I'm Rob Keiter, I'm Program Coordinator at the Special Education Resolution Center. And I did a training several weeks ago for the ODDS Executive Committee members and some State Department personnel on IEP facilitation on the district level. And today's webinar will be a very brief overview, introduction to that training that we're hoping to be able to roll out to school districts this fall and next spring. It's a one-day training, so the best I can do today is just to give you an overview of some of the high points of the training. But I'm glad you're here today. And just to set this up, the Special Education Resolution Center, we provide, as you know, mediation where there's a specific dispute in mind and either the school or the parents can request mediation. Both of them have to agree to use a mediator, and then we provide one of our mediators to mediate that dispute. But and that's part of IDEA. Mediation is directly involved in IDEA. But we also provide a service called IEP Facilitation. And that's not provided under IDEA, but it's a growing service and process that's being used in Oklahoma and around the country. In fact, we probably have 3-to-1 requests for IEP facilitation versus mediation. But this is where there's an IEP team, and maybe they've been having some difficult meetings, conflicted meetings, and just like mediation, either the parent or the school can request a facilitator come to facilitate that IEP meeting. Both parties, the school and parent, have to agree. And then we send one of our mediators to facilitate the IEP meeting. And of course, the goal of the IEP team meeting is to be able to listen to each other, work together, discuss all the issues that are involved in the student's IEP, and try to collaborate and work together to make decisions. So we send facilitators to facilitate difficult meetings, and we will continue doing that. But at the same time, it's important to understand that part of our mission, I should just say our mission at SERC, is to help families and schools resolve disputes at the earliest stage possible. So that's where this comes in. But we also, in that mission, we provide stakeholder training. And the training is designed to build local capacity to support effective collaboration in service of children and youth. And so this training that I did several weeks ago really is in this very goal that I just mentioned. We'll always continue to provide facilitation, sending a third-party neutral to facilitate an IEP meeting, but we really want to help school districts and parents in terms of building local capacity to provide IEP facilitation. So the idea behind this training is that this training is something that could be provided to school districts where they were able to identify individuals that might be really effective in facilitating difficult IEP meetings within the district. Of course, regularly, the teacher of record oftentimes, leads the meeting, maybe a special education administrator, but we're thinking that it might be helpful if school districts identified individuals. Maybe they were counselors, maybe they're special ed people, maybe they might be serving in the role of the teacher of record, but different administrators, someone that would be able to come in and facilitate a difficult meeting within the district, short of actually reaching out to us. So as I'm saying, we're always going to continue doing that, but we want to help school districts build capacity on the local level to handle these kinds of meetings. And that's what this training is really about. So during this training, I want you to be thinking about that may be something that a district might be interested in having us come to train people that would serve in this role, but it also could be really effective for others within the district, maybe administrators or others that find themselves facilitating difficult meetings, not necessarily IEP meetings, but other meetings within the district. I think that learning these skills, at least this is the feedback I got from the training we did a few weeks ago, could be very helpful to anyone facilitating a meeting. So I'm going to try to go through some of these high points and just overview the basic things that are involved in the training, which, as I said, will be probably a day-long training. And first of all, let's just start by looking at some of the benefits of having a facilitator that's trained to facilitate an IEP meeting. First of all, there's local capacity for supporting shared decision making. That's going to be a positive thing. Hopefully improving the working relationships among the adults that are committed to supporting the educational needs of children and youth. Greater focus and efficiency for the team. I think a real important thing is supporting for all parties to participate fully, helping to bring about a clarification of points of agreement and disagreement. Another couple is encouraging parents and professionals to identify new options to address complex challenges they may be facing. And then finally, supporting better follow through and follow up, because roles and responsibilities can be discussed and planned. But these are just some of the general benefits of facilitation within an IEP meeting. Now, there's some key functions that I want us to think about regarding what facilitators do, just in general. And the word facilitate, it's interesting, it comes from the Latin adjective facilis, which means easy. So to facilitate, the goal is to make easy or easier, make that meeting easier. And the work of a facilitator is in service to the group that they're working for. In general, a group is asking a facilitator to do what, for some reason, the group is unable to do for itself. And so some examples of that would be to help the group stay on task, help them to manage their time wisely, help to maintain a psychologically safe environment in which the group or team can have a challenging conversation. The facilitator can ask questions that the team seems unable or maybe unwilling to ask, and then help the team to listen to and acknowledge each other's divergent opinions, experiences, and expertise. But basically, there are 4 key functions of a facilitator that I want to just share with you briefly this morning. And they are to observe, stimulate, support, and guide the team. And we're going to look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So the first one is facilitators observe. And let me mention a few things to you before we look at this slide. If you think about it, and this has been my experience when I've been part of a team that's deliberating and trying to collaborate, I think a lot of us, when we participate in a group process like a team, it's easy to lack awareness of how the group is functioning at both an individual and a collective level. So when I'm in a meeting, a lot of time my focus, I think just it's human nature, our focus is on our perspective and what we hope to bring to the conversation. Now, one primary function of the facilitator, and this is really important, is to observe the functioning of the team at both an individual and a collective level, and then provide the group with information from these observations that will support them to be more effective. I learned, I think, a really great metaphor for this from the Harvard School of Negotiation, and it's the metaphor of the dance floor and the balcony. So here's the gist of this metaphor. Let's just say you're dancing in a big ballroom, and most of your attention is probably focused on your dance partner, and then you reserve whatever's left to make sure you don't collide with the dancers close by. And when somebody asks you later about the dance, you might say, well, the band played great and the place surged with dancers. But think about this. If you had gone up to the balcony and looked down on the dance floor, had a different view, you might have seen a very different picture. I mean, you might have noticed all kinds of different patterns. You might have noticed that when slow music played, only some people danced. When the tempo increased, others stepped onto the floor. And you might have noticed that some people never seemed to dance at all. You might have noticed the dancers all clustered at one end of the floor, possibly as far away from the band as possible. And when reporting about it, you might have said participation was sporadic, the band played too loud, and you only danced to fast music. So think about this with that metaphor of the dance floor and the balcony. The only way you can gain a clearer view of reality and some perspective on the bigger picture is by distancing yourself from the fray, getting up on that balcony. And then if you want to affect what's happening, you've got to return to the dance floor. The role, if you think about it, the role of the facilitator is to move seamlessly between the dance floor and the balcony, making observations in service of the group's effectiveness. So, and this is really a powerful function. And basically it might include bringing a sense of curiosity into the place, which that's what a facilitator does, watching for nonverbal clues about what's happening and sharing these observations with the team, modeling good listening by restating, reflecting, reframing, and summarizing. Those are some active listening skills that we'll briefly mention later. Watching for resistance and defensiveness in the team, and then being ready to clarify perceptions and assumptions, sometimes clearing up misunderstandings. And then also the facilitator, as they observe, they might listen for gifts from one side to the other, from the school to the parents. Those gifts might be a willingness to make concessions. It might be an acknowledgement of another's perspective or interest, or maybe interim agreements. And so what I have on the slide again is, the facilitator in this observing role is listening deeply to what is said and how it's being interpreted by others. And that second part of that sentence is very important because it's really not primarily about what's being said, but how is it being perceived by others. And it's going to include both verbal and nonverbal behavior. And that facilitator is going to be assessing the participation of group members in the work. So this first function, a big one, is observing. And think about it again from the metaphor of being on the dance floor versus being on the balcony and being able to come back to the dance floor, intervene, going back to the balcony, watching what's happening, and moving back and forth between the dance floor and the balcony. That's the first function. But the facilitators not only observe, they also stimulate. So they ask questions and they summarize to build understanding. And that's the goal of asking the questions, is building understanding among the team members and generating discussion. They also help the parties to see the issue in a way that's neutral and consensual, since the facilitator isn't primarily representing the school or the parent, but they're there as a neutral third party. And they use hypothetical examples to get them to look at other perspectives. So they stimulate the work of the team. And one of the primary functions in doing that is asking questions. And also it's the way they ask the questions, because they come in with a real sense of curiosity as they ask those questions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about asking good questions. We won't be able to go into the detail that I did in the training, but I will mention a few things with you, because questions are a tool that facilitators use. But facilitators observe, facilitators stimulate. The third function is facilitators support. So they support by building rapport, they use appropriate humor, and encourage the parties by coming in with a focus on the future. They also support by discouraging bottom lining or ultimatums by any of the parties, by acknowledging and affirming the interests that come out from the different parties on the team. They use reframing to refocus the parties from negative to positive, positions to interests, and past to future. We'll talk a little bit more about reframing when we talk about active listening. They also can help the parties to save face by privately recognizing their emotional and psychological interests. If I'm facilitating an IEP meeting, I typically don't meet separately with the school personnel and with the parents and anyone that they have with them, possibly an advocate. But sometimes in a really conflicted meeting, or sometimes when I think it might be helpful, I can meet with the school personnel or meet with the parents. And sometimes that will be to be able to help them and privately recognizing their emotional and psychological interest in a way that wouldn't be effective if I was addressing those things in the presence of everyone on the team. So that's something that facilitators can do in supporting. And then also they can neutrally describe disruptive behavior in the meeting and specify what would help. Now they can neutrally do it, and that word neutrally is really important there. But facilitators support. And then the final function is facilitators guide. So they actually can help the group find direction. They can be very flexible in their management of the process as they guide. They focus the parties on areas of mutual gain. And I should say, even before mutual gain, common ground and mutual gain. And they help the parties develop multiple options for consideration as they're collaborating. And finally, this is a really important one, they also can encourage maximum specificity in whatever the agreements are that the team reaches. So if the team reaches an agreement that there's going to be testing that's going to take place and the parent agrees to sign consent, the facilitator can help ensure that there's the necessary specificity here so that expectations are clear and everybody's on the same page. In other words, what exactly will the testing include? They can be specific about this. When will the testing take place, or at least by this date? If the team is going to meet to review the data, review the testing results, when will that meeting take place, the date and time? Specific things that need to be part of their agreement, once again, so that expectations can be clear between all the members of the team. So facilitators observe, they support, they I forgot the third one. They actually, let's look back at that. They support, they stimulate, they support, and then finally they guide. They guide the team. Those are the four basic functions of a facilitator. Now, the next thing I want to mention just a few key attributes that a facilitator needs to have. The first one is neutrality. And the standard for neutrality implies that the facilitator is free from any relevant bias. And it's all about perception, but they need to be perceived as being neutral. They also need to be perceived as being impartial. And that means the facilitator will maintain a process that's free from relevant bias and will treat the parties as equals. They'll be working equally with all the parties. I'll say that I'm not an advocate for the school. I'm not an advocate for the parents. I'm an advocate for the process of helping you work together to discuss these issues and collaborate as a team. You make all of the decisions. So impartiality is important. Multi-partiality is also important. It's a little different. We're going to work with the parties evenly, but we also will support people in the way they need it. To participate in the process, so that the facilitator can realize that maybe one party needs a little bit more support to be able to be fully involved. So multi-partiality. And then finally, very importantly, one of the attributes of a facilitator would be self-awareness as it relates to all of the things above and to their role in the overall process. Being self-aware. Those are some attributes to just be thinking about. The next part of the training, and we won't have time to go through these, but I do want to at least mention them in this overview, is that I talk about what would the facilitator's role be before an IEP meeting, during the meeting, and then finally after the meeting. And if you look on the right side of that slide, you'll see the first one is really about before the meeting, the preparation aspect. What kind of intake, what kind of discussions are there with the school, with the parents prior to facilitating the IEP meeting? Any kind of preparation that's involved, communication that's involved. And then the next three on this list are all during the meeting, the actual convening of the meeting, and facilitating that meeting, starting it and getting it moving. And then as you go through the meeting, helping the team increase shared understanding among all of the team members, exploring the issues, identifying the interests of the different members of the team. And then finally, at the conclusion of the meeting, helping to take that insight and turn it into action. Actually coming up with a plan that includes specificity and then really lets us know, here's how we're going to implement the decisions that were made today in this meeting. And it results in closure, the final ending of the meeting. Finally, the last one is after the meeting's over. What kind of follow-up would need to happen between the facilitator with the school and the parents? So we spend some time really walking through each aspect of before, during, and after the meeting. That's part of this training. Okay, and then the rest of the training, and it was really the second half of the day, is I shared some things that I'm calling the facilitator's toolbox. And these include strategies that can be used for building understanding, for engaging, and for navigating conflict. So tools, and we're going to look at different tools. Sorry, that backed up. So the first tool is active listening. And let me mention a few things before we look at some reasons for active listening and briefly mention some key elements. One thing I think to just start off with is realize there's a big difference between doing active listening and being an active listener. Doing active listening versus being an active listening. I mean, I've been in meetings, not just IEP meetings, but in any kind of meeting where you'll see someone and hear something that tells me right away, well, this person has learned a little bit about active listening and they're doing active listening right now. But it doesn't feel quite like necessarily being an active listener. And it's because it sounds formulaic and disingenuous. Maybe it's just a skill that's been learned and you'll hear someone say, so if I understand what you're saying, I hear you to say, and they fill in the blank. But it sounds kind of like a script that's being read. They are doing active listening, so that's a positive thing. But what we really want to shoot for, especially if we're facilitators, but really each of us in any interactions we have with others when we're communicating, is we want to be an active listening. And I think a couple of the key differences there is when you are being an active listener, you really are driven by true curiosity. You really want to learn, and also by respect. And that's what differs from just doing active listening and being an active listener. So, okay, so with that in mind, let's look at some of the reasons why active listening is such an important tool. First of all, it lets the person know, whoever's talking, it lets them know that you're listening. I mean, people want to be heard. Saying something like, I hear what you're saying, it might be, well, the intention might be good, but it doesn't really communicate understanding. Telling the person in your own words what you hear them to be saying is really what's needed here. I've heard John Maxwell used to make the statement, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I find that to be really true. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But I've also heard this statement, which is absolutely true. One of the greatest ways that you communicate to someone else that you care is by them, excuse me, by them watching you, really paying attention to them and listening. Listening to others communicates to them, wow, you care about what I'm saying, or you care about me as a person, or you care about my goals, about what's important to me, but you care. And I have found, I believe that sometimes one of the things that keeps people so escalated and stuck in conflict is really just the idea that they feel like they've never been heard. So one of the greatest things you can do as a facilitator is help people to listen. And this active listening is letting people know that you listen. The second thing is active listening results in a clarification of what the intent was of the person that was speaking and what the impact is on the person that's listening to them. So what's important is not just that you share something, but what's important is that the person that you're sharing it with is interpreting what you're saying in a way that's on the same page with what your intent is, that they're lining up, that the perception of what they're hearing and what they're understanding, what their interpretation is right in line with what you really want to share. And so this is so important, this clarification of intent and impact for facilitators, because facilitators can identify where miscommunication or misunderstandings are happening. They can identify those things and they can help clear them up. It also, active listening facilitates exploration. So as you reflect your understanding of what's been communicated or understood, it assists the speaker to determine if that's what they really meant to communicate. And if not, you might hear something like, yeah, that's what I said, and I realize it's not quite what I meant. Let me try it again. But it facilitates exploration. It also can diffuse emotion. So when you're engaging someone that's angry or hostile, one strategy for diffusing their hostility is to engage in genuine, respectful, active listening. And then finally, it can slow the process down. I mean, active listening helps the listener to avoid making assumptions and jumping to inaccurate conclusions. So those are just some reasons why active listening is so important. Now, the members of the team hopefully are listening, are doing active listening, but whether or not they are, the facilitator is. And the facilitator is monitoring listening, monitoring what the communication, but they're also modeling it. And so it's just a really important tool to use. Now, there are some key elements in active listening that I can just very briefly mention. There's a social scientist, Robert Kharkov, that divided active listening into two dimensions. The first dimension is listening as attending, and then the second is listening as responding. And listening as attending are just the things that we would do behaviorally that show the person that we're listening to, that show them that we're really paying attention to them. It might be making eye contact or having squared shoulders instead of just leaning back in a way that doesn't demonstrate that paying attention, or not having any distractions going, that we're really paying attention. Once again, feet on the floor, and maybe even sometimes physically leaning into the conversation when we're really wanting to understand what's being said. We're not actually responding, but they are some of the attending behaviors that might, before we even say anything, communicate to the person that, hey, we're paying attention to them. We care, we're listening. And then the other elements, listening as responding behaviors, are what we would actually refer to as active listening, where we're encouraging, restating, reflecting, reframing, and summarizing. And I can only hit these very briefly, but encouraging isn't what you would normally think of as providing encouragement. It's just a way of basically encouraging the speaker to continue to share or say more about what's being communicated. It's a response that says, I'm tracking you, and I really want to hear more of what you have to say. Restating might be considered classic active listening. In this context, you, the listener, restate in your own words. You're not parroting, but you're paraphrasing in your own words. You're restating what you understand. And what it does is it involves processing what's been shared, framing it into language that makes sense to you in order to assess your understanding of the speaker's intent. Restating. Reflecting is focusing on the emotional elements of what's being shared. It might be, well, in difficult conversations, it's not enough to just respond to what's being shared. Sometimes we need to acknowledge the emotional content of the message. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's what reflecting is about. Reframing is probably one of the most important active listening behaviors and responses, because in reframing, it's less about responding to what's being shared explicitly and more about acknowledging what's being shared implicitly. I heard this recently, and this just really stuck with me. The idea is that embedded in any complaint, when we hear somebody sharing their frustration with something, and it just sounds like a complaint, but embedded in that complaint is often a request. It's just that request is hidden. So when we're listening to someone sharing their frustration about circumstances, one can actually restate the content of the complaint or reflect the emotions that are being conveyed. But you can also, as I was mentioning, highlight the implied request, need, or interest that often is hidden in that complaint. Because what happens is, and we all know this personally, sometimes we can be so focused on what's not working that we're totally unaware of what might work or what we really need. Reframing holds this up to people for their consideration, and it really is a powerful skill that facilitators use. It is an active listening skill, but what it can do is it can shift a conversation. It can shift it from the negative to the positive. It can shift it from the past to the future. And so it really can make a big difference there, reframing. And then finally, another aspect of the active listening on the responding side would be summarizing, where you're actually taking a lot of information that's been shared and you're summarizing the key salient points in a clear, succinct manner. So all of those are elements of listening as responding. And that's the first tool that we would spend more time in the training on, but that's a very important tool, active listening. The second tool is questions, asking questions in service of shared understanding. The purpose of asking these questions isn't to get the answer we want. It's not to go in any particular direction, but it really is to build understanding. One thing that I've heard, I think that's really important, is the questions that we ask determines the conversation that we have. And if we don't like the direction of the conversation where it's going, we can actually ask a different conversation to change the direction of that conversation. If we want to shift the structure of the conversation, ask a different question. I list this as a tool. And I want you to think about questions. These are all tools, but really think about questions as tools. Greg Abel is a wonderful national mediator and mediation trainer. He's actually done a lot of trainings for the Special Education Resolution Center. He's spoken at our conferences. He's prepared a series of modules called Engaging Conversations that's on our stakeholder training page. And Greg is a gardener. And Greg will tell you that when he's talking about questions as tools, he'll say, he's got all kinds of tools for his gardening. And he'll say, if I'm going to move a tree, take a tree out, I'm not going to use a small trowel. I'm going to use a big shovel. If I'm planting a small plant, I'm not going to use a shovel. I'm going to use a trowel, because tools work, and different tools are chosen and used based on the need or the nature of the work. So what I'm sharing with you today is, in our context, when we're talking about facilitation and tools that facilitators use, questions are tools that we use in service or with the goal of building understanding, mutual understanding, shared understanding. I'm not talking about agreement yet or solutions. We're not anywhere near there, but just understanding. Because when we build a bridge of mutual understanding, then oftentimes we are able to explore options and find solutions. So just understand that different questions do different types of work. And I'll just say a few more things about questions. If I can get my slide to move here, the power of questions, a few things here, and I'll just put all of these up and we'll look at them. But what we ask, so the particular question we use, the spirit in which we ask that question, and how we ask it, they all invite certain responses and discourage others. So it's not just important that we ask the best question, but we ask it in the right way. We ask it out of genuine curiosity, not trying to get a specific answer we want, but really wanting, again, to build understanding. When we ask those kinds of questions in those ways, we encourage others to enter the discussion and get to dialogue. When we ask in a different way, it shuts down the conversation. So that's important to know. Also, questions influence the way we tell our stories and what we include and what we lead out. The very act of asking a question instead of just arguing about what we've been arguing about can really have a profound influence. Questions have the power to shape meaning. So it's just very important to understand the power of questions, or the power to shape meaning and expand or restrict the possibility for action. So as I was mentioning, if we're just asking a leading question and we know the answer we already want to get, that's really going to restrict the possibility for action, for genuinely effectively being able to address the issues and find solutions if we're asking questions that way. So it really makes a difference, the questions we ask and the way that we ask those questions. The third tool that I want to mention is what I'm calling conversational structures. Remember, you're bringing a different way of observing. So you're seeing things from a different way of what's happening individually and what's happening within the group. But I'm going to share with you right here in this tool an important paradigm for making sense of what's happening and providing structure for strategizing how to best support the group. And there's Morton Deutsch is a social psychologist, and he came up with a definition of what he says are the basic elements of interpersonal conflict. So conflict on a horizontal level between individuals. And let me just open this slide all the way up, and then we'll take a look at this, because I think you will absolutely understand this, but it's a great definition. So he says that interpersonal conflict is where two or more people are interacting and perceiving incompatible differences or threats related to resources, needs, or values. And then what happens is it results, that perception that they have results in a behavioral response from the parties. That's the point of conflict, the choice point that if you look on the slide. And that point of conflict, depending on the behavioral response, is going to do one of two things. It's either going to escalate the experience of conflict or de-escalate it. So look at that again. It's a very simple model, but very powerful. Two or more people interact and perceive incompatible differences or threats around resources, needs, values. They behave and respond, and that choice point of what happens there results in escalating or de-escalating the conflict. Well, I want you to think about that, because in this model, if you think about it, the source of conflict could be said to reside between our ears. It's really an interpretation. It's an experience within our interpretation of differences of opinion or perspective as being threatening and dangerous. There's a lady, Tracy Goss, in her book, The Last Word on Power. She introduces the notion of the universal human paradigm. And that's the model I want us to think about here. It's a simple model. It's structured as follows. There's a way that things should be. And when things are that way, things are right. When they're not that way, there's something wrong with me, with them, or with it. And I need to fix it. I mean, that's pretty simple, but stated in another way that I think really is driven more to home where what we experience. In any discussion where we are experiencing differences of opinion, there's obviously a right or wrong answer. It's this kind of thinking. There's a right or a wrong answer. From my perspective, it's obvious that I'm right. And given that we both can't be right, then you are obviously wrong. And in the context of this universal human paradigm, it's my job to fix this discord by convincing you that I am right and you are wrong. That is exactly what happens so many different times. We get stuck in this paradigm that one of us has to be right. It must be me. You know, if it can only be one of us, it has to be me. And so I have to prove myself right and I have to prove you wrong. And what that does, staying in that kind of paradigm, it just absolutely sabotages any kind of collaboration, because we get polarized in our positions and our thinking, and our behavior at that point becomes totally focused on defending our perspective. And what happens is very little effort, if any, is directed at understanding the thinking of the person that we now see as our adversary. And so it's really important that we challenge this paradigm and don't go there. And as facilitators, we can be very aware of this paradigm, and then we can help people reframe that so that they're not looking at each other as adversaries, but as allies. But the key to that is they have to absolutely avoid this particular paradigm of me having to defend, because once I get to that point and we're totally paralyzed, I just totally discard the ability to really listen to what you're saying for understanding. And at this point, I'm just proving myself right and totally on the defensive. But I think that's an important paradigm to understand. And it's that third tool. All right, let's look at the fourth tool. I'm watching the time here because I'd like to finish by 1 so that if we have any questions, you can answer, we can address those. The fourth tool is separating interest from positions. I don't know if you're familiar with the book entitled Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Roger Fisher and William Ury. Tremendous book on negotiation. And in this, the authors provide a structure for understanding what needs to happen in order to fully unpack and resolve an issue. And so effective facilitators not only help parties discuss the issues, but they do this by helping the parties move beyond their positions and focus on the underlying interest. And I'm going to open this slide all the way up for you, or part way up, and we'll spend just a few minutes on this. Oh, let me back that up 1. So let's just recognize that when we come together to make decisions around difficult issues, you'll see the issue right there in the center, we typically bring our positions to the conversation. So that's P1 is the position 1. We could just say that's the school's position. Position 2, maybe it would be the parent's position, but we bring our positions. I want you to understand our positions basically usually include a couple things. They include our perspective on the issue or our interpretation of the issue, but they also include our preferred solution, what we think will solve it. And so people come in initially with their position. This is what I want, and it includes their perspective as well. Now, here's the thing to understand. When our positions are perceived as compatible, there's no problem. But when our positions threaten each other, or we perceive that they threaten each other, just like we looked at in that earlier paradigm, we open ourselves up to what Ury and Fisher call the dark side of conflict. And this is where self-awareness and choice become really critical. And here's the choice. Are we going to defend our positions, again, where I have to be right and you have to be wrong, just like what we looked at earlier? Or are we going to suspend judgment and be open for a little bit to seeking to understand the interests that are driving the positions of each of us? Are we going to defend our positions, fight over our positions, or will we be open to understanding the interests that are driving each of us? So if you look at this next one, you'll see that there, underneath each of these positions, there are interests that are driving those positions. And what we need to understand is that while the position may express really what we want, I want this, and then the other says, no, I want this, the interest actually expresses why this is important to them, what their underlying interest is, why it's really important that they want what they want. And so a wise and effective decision is not found in a compromise between our positions, which is often what we do. You know, I want this and no, you can't have that. And there's arguing back and forth. And then maybe we try to compromise in the middle somewhere. But a wise and effective decision is, for the most part, not found in just a compromise between positions, but in a solution that meets as many of our shared and independent interests as possible. So let me just finish this out. It would be where we're not just staying on the level of positions, we're unpacking that issue so that we can find out the underlying interest of each of the parties, or we should say of all of the parties if it's a team. And then we're really focusing on that, and we're giving special attention to the common ground that you see right here at the very bottom. There's an area of common ground between the parties that we want to focus on. That and just the independent interest. When we focus on that, we can actually get to options, better options, and ultimately reach a solution. So and let me just mention one other thing before our time runs out, another way of looking at positions and interests. When you think about focusing on interest, just picture with me, if you would, an iceberg. And you're on a cruise ship and you see this iceberg above the water, right? And let's just say the iceberg is going to relate to these positions up here. They're above the water. Well, you can see how big it is and you can see where it is. And obviously that's going to be really important. And the ship is going to do everything possible to avoid that iceberg above the water. But in terms of understanding positions and interests, think about this. Underneath that water, there might be an area that's 10 times larger of that iceberg under the water than what they can see above. It may be huge in terms of the importance for a ship avoiding it, just like it can be huge in terms of the importance and helpfulness of helping a team be able to get to a good solution, understanding what's underneath. And so this is just a really important skill that facilitators use, is to help separate positions from interest and help the parties get to the underlying interest. And think about this, if we're going to recognize the positions are what we see at first and often focus on and sometimes get stuck on what's above the surface, and the interests are under the surface and may be huge in terms of importance, it's questions, for the most part, that are going to be the tools that will help us unpack an issue and create a deeper shared understanding that can open up these options that you see here and ultimately lead to mutually acceptable solutions. I'll give you one example here in an IEP team meeting, and I've seen this many times. Let's say a parent says, I want a full-time paraprofessional for my child. And then the school says, well, it's not appropriate for your child to have a full-time paraprofessional. And then using different words and phrases and such, they go back and forth arguing about those positions. Those are positions. But what can be very, very helpful, and I've done this as a facilitator, and I recently in an IEP team meeting, one of the members of the team did this and used this facilitator skill of asking a good question. And basically, I would say something like, and it needs to be genuine, because I really want to understand. To the parent, can you help me understand why or in what way your child having that full-time paraprofessional, how would that help their education? Why is that something that's basically, I'm not saying it that way, but what I'm really asking is, why is that so important to you? Now, when you ask a question like that, you really have to ask it with curiosity and in a genuine way in which you really are wanting to understand. And I'll tell you, I believe one reason that's so important is you don't know what the reason is. Why that's so important to the parent might be that it will help their child in an academic deficiency. It'll help improve their academics. It might be that it's a safety concern for them in terms of the child, the student making transitions throughout the day. But the idea here is, when you can understand what the underlying interest is of the one, and also what the underlying interest is of the school, of all the parties that are involved, then you can look at that. That's when options, once again, can begin to appear, new options, ultimately leading to a solution. Now, that solution might be a full-time paraprofessional, but that solution may be something completely different. But the reason you can get to that option and get to that solution is because you understand the common ground and the underlying interest, and you've used the question to do that. So one more thing, and then we'll move quickly, and that is, I just think in general, when you're focusing on just positions and you're not getting to those interests, that's like thinking in black and white. But when you're focusing on the underlying interest, it's thinking in color. And it just opens things up, and it can open up the discussion. Okay, I've got to really move on. What is the one common interest? The one common interest is the student, that the whole team has in mind. But we've got to, work together in such a way that that stays in the forefront. All right, the next tool is conflict analysis. I'm going to move through this one very quickly, but there is a book that some of you are familiar with. This book. It is, let me see, pull it up here. Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most, in terms of dealing with difficult conversations, by Stone, Patton, and Heen. And some of you have read this book, but basically they say, when you're engaged in a challenging conversation, think about a really difficult IEP team meeting. You're actually encountering a complex conversation that's comprised of three distinct and yet integrated threads of the conversation. It's not just one conversation. There are three threads going on. And they describe the what happened conversation that focuses on our different interpretation of the facts of the situation. The feelings conversation is less about what happened and more about how I feel about what happened. And then at the same time, there's an identity conversation often going on that really focuses on how this conversation is challenging my sense of core identity. So let's just very quickly look at the rest of these. The what happened conversation, this conversation is about disagreement about what really happened. Often it's about who is right, who is to blame. And so that's a very real one. This is often the most easily recognized of the three conversations. You don't have any problem spotting this. It's where the parties are overtly arguing what happened, what people meant, who is right, who is wrong, who's to blame. And a lot of times teams can get stuck in that. And this kind of conversation often becomes apparent in the party's initial framing of the problem, the challenge, the issue. So that's the first conversation. The second conversation is the feelings conversation. I'm just going to open this slide up right away, because this conversation, again, may be explicit, but it's often implicit. There's an emotional response that you can see in the context that often needs to be acknowledged and understood. So in this context, how I feel about what's happening is actually more important than what I think about it. And as a facilitator, you really are listening for the explicit and implicit expression of emotion, and you're going to acknowledge it. And one thing, so you'll see here, I think we could all understand is just think about ourselves in difficult conversations. But this feeling conversation comes in where we might feel uncomfortable when something we value feels lost or threatened. Or and this is real important, our feelings are the best source of information about what is most important. It's actually our feelings. So when I hear people say emotions don't have any part in helping folks resolve conflict, I would totally disagree with that. Emotions are very important because they really can be the best source of information about what's most important. Our failure to acknowledge, at least on some level, and possibly discuss feelings, it derails a startling number of difficult conversations. And then it's going to be real important as a facilitator is to find the feelings that are lurking underneath what comes off as, attribution, judgments, and accusations that might be made by the party. So think about it this way. A lot of times in conflict, participants exhibit behavior that we, initially just interpret as anger. That's just an angry person, right? They're frustrated, they're angry. But I think importantly, we need to recognize that anger can be and has been described as a secondary emotion that often is masking the primary emotions that could be fear, hurt, sadness, frustration, confusion. And so this just ties right into the underlying interest. I mean, those are the things that really may be the primary emotions that then are being exhibited through anger. So this feeling part of the conversation is very important. A facilitator is going to be really watching for this and they're observing so that they can at least acknowledge this and help the parties be able to move past this. The third conversation, again, is the identity conversation. And I'll just put these up here because this one is really important. This conversation is, it's probably the more challenging conversation because it's really where the conversation, for one reason or another, is challenging my sense of who I am. It may be on my interpretation of what I'm hearing and understanding you to be saying, but I think recognize this. It also can be the result of my own internal cognitive dissonance. So in other words, we're talking about, most of the time we talk about horizontal interpersonal conflict between parties, but there can be something that's been called intrapersonal conflict, and that is a conflict around values within each of us. So this one can be very, very important. Very quickly, sometimes, to give you an example, a parent could be in a meeting and they're talking about behavior of their child that their child was engaged in that's resulted in certain kind of discipline. And on one hand, this is internal again. On one hand, the parent is very concerned about that discipline and maybe believes it should be taking place in a different kind of way. But on the other hand, internally, they may have that dissonance within them that they also recognize that behavior isn't appropriate. And they really don't want their child behaving in that way. And so there's a conflict within the person. And this can be anybody on the team, but just recognize this identity conversation is probably the deepest of all of them, but it also can be part of the whole conversational thread. So that's just a quick look at that. Just in terms of our time, I need to move a little quicker, but we've got a little bit of time here. I want to mention this. I think this is really an incredible tool. It's called the Ladder of Influence, first proposed by organizational psychologist Chris Argyris. And basically, it's a process of how we make meaning of things. And so if you look at it over here on the right-hand side, and from the bottom up, and these are like climbing a ladder up these rungs, And it really shows how we just move from one piece of data, which might be a comment made or something you've observed to happen, through a series of mental processes up these rungs here to reach a conclusion. So it's how we make meaning. So level one, you encounter an experience. You see or hear something, okay? It might be a person, a comment, facial expression, information. It could be any kind of data. And then after encountering that, you go up to the next rung. And at this rung, you select some aspect of that data to focus your attention on. Might be one of those same things: comment, facial expression, opinion. And then you move up the ladder and you add meaning. You tell yourself a story about what that person was doing, what that thing means, what you saw happen. You create a story. What happens next as you move up the line is you adopt beliefs about that situation or that person. So basically, you develop a narrative that's designed to help you express your interpretation and your understanding of the context. You create that story. I need to say, the story you create, and this really ties in with Crucial Conversations training, but the story you create in and of itself creates emotions. And then you climb up to that final one. You take action based on those beliefs that you've now developed and those feelings. But here's the really powerful thing. This is, I think, important enough just to understand this ladder of inference. But the biggest part is when you look over here on this left side and see this reflexive loop, and understand that these beliefs and feelings that we've developed over here on the right side, they then influence future data, what we see and hear in the future that we select when we find ourselves in similar circumstances. And what it shows is we tend to select data that supports the beliefs that we've already determined at the top of this ladder. This goes right along with what I like to talk about in Crucial Conversations regarding confirmation bias. It's another way of talking about this, because basically confirmation bias is that we see things, new information, we view new information through the lens of what we already believe, what we already have come to know. And so that affects what we select to focus on, but also selects the way we see it. And a couple things to realize is we climb this ladder in seconds. It's human nature. We can't get around this because it really is what we all do all the time in a way to try to make sense of the world around us, make sense of what we see and what we hear. So we're doing it. We do it automatically without even thinking about it. We do it very, very quickly. And the real problem with this, or the thing that the facilitator will be very aware of, is that a couple of the problems we encounter is that when we observe this new data and we're looking at it through the lens of what we already know and what we already believe, we oftentimes confuse the facts, what we actually have seen and heard, with the beliefs that we've determined, with our interpretation, with our story. And we start to think that our story really is the facts, when in reality, it's our story. And some stories are better than others. And so it's very important to recognize this so that we can help people be able to come back to the facts, realize that there may be, and usually are, different stories, different ways of interpreting the same things, but just at least recognize how it is human nature for us to see things in a way that is really confirming what we already believe. And that can really get us stuck. So we want to make sure, on a personal level, I want to be sure when I'm sharing my perspective, that I'm sharing it as a perspective. It's my story, it's my perspective. I'm not sharing it as the facts. And I'm also, this may be the most important thing, really interested in understanding your perspective, understanding your story. so that we can work together and we can collaborate. We could take a lot more time on that, but I think that's a really powerful tool to understand. A couple more. Tool number 6 would be learning to monitor and manage safety during conversations. And what we mean by safety here is when people don't feel safe or when they don't feel comfortable to be able to share their input with others, this is a crucial conversation skill. They either go to silence or they go to verbal violence. And here's what we mean by those. Silence is anything we do to withhold our meaning from others. It's not necessarily literally not saying anything. It might be we just aren't really, we're holding back our meaning. It might be we do this by understating our true opinions, by sugarcoating or sarcasm. Or I've seen this a lot, using phrases like, some people don't think this would be a good idea, when really it's me. I don't think this would be a good idea. That's going to silence. Changing the topic and deflecting off to something else when sensitive subjects are brought up. Or it could even just include withdrawing from conversations or relationships altogether. But understand this, and facilitators are really watching for this, watching the verbal, watching the nonverbals, to see if there are any signs that individuals are not feeling safe, they're not feeling comfortable to be able to get to dialogue, and so they're going to silence. Now, if they don't go to silence, they go to verbal violence. And verbal violence, it's not literally necessarily screaming at someone, but it's anything we do to, in essence, push our meaning on others. So it might look like this. It might be where we exaggerate by using absolutes, always, never. I mean, I hear that a lot. Or labeling. This is where labeling and name calling comes in. Or you've got somebody that's monopolizing or just hijacking the conversation. It might be where they use directive questions, leading questions, but not with the goal of building understanding, with the goal of controlling and manipulating. Or maybe belittling ideas or people, and it can actually even result in different kinds of threatening. But the idea here is, as facilitators, and this is a facilitator skill that anyone could learn, we want to be really aware of what's the safety level in this meeting, and watching for signs that any individuals are not feeling safe, comfortable to share, and so they're going to silence or going to verbal violence. If we were in this training that I actually did earlier, we would actually talk about, and I'm sure it would be easy for all of you to be able to think of examples in IEP team meeting interactions where we actually would talk about what does it look like when folks are going to silence, or what does it look like, what might it sound like when individuals are going to verbal violence. But a facilitator wants to be aware of these things. Okay. The last tool really here is some strategies for de-escalating emotions, or de-escalating high emotions in conflict. And I just put them all on the screen here. The first one is that the facilitator, I think, can do this from the very beginning of the meeting. And I try to do this as a facilitator by sharing the communication guidelines that we've established at SERC. That's one of the outlines that you have, one of the handouts in the chat. You may already be familiar with that, but we just have some very basic, simple, we call them communication guidelines, that I like to share with the team at the very top to set the tone for listening, to set the tone for a good conversation. And then also to get buy-in from everyone, because always that happens. Do these sound reasonable to you? I'll say that to the whole team. And inevitably, you'll see individuals saying, yes, we do. And then that kind of sets the tone. And it also gives us a common base that we could go back to if there's any real divergence from that. But that's one thing. Acknowledging the difficult emotions, that's something facilitators can do. It doesn't mean drilling down into the weeds of what's going on, but at least acknowledging something to the effect, I respect the emotions of the moment here. Sometimes even a very simple acknowledgement can go a long ways to de-escalate conflict. The facilitator can really make a difference by staying calm and even-keeled, even-mannered, by not, in essence, getting on the emotional roller coaster that the parties may be on sometimes. That staying calm, soft voice, even mannered makes a difference. Helping the parties focus by asking those questions. We talked about that. There's more to this that I would share with you in the longer training, sharing information, making proposals, helping the parties look at you, directing them to look at you sometimes to help them refocus. That can be helpful. Helping them slow down. Sometimes it might even be saying, let's slow this down right now. Just helping them slow down to listen to each other. Because I'll say to the parties, I find that if we'll listen to each other in this way and slow things down, it really can help us and be able to understand each other, be able to collaborate. It can help us a lot. This is something facilitators do. They make determinations. They're very flexible, and they're making judgment calls of when to let arguments go on or when to stop them. And in the back of my mind, I'm always asking myself, is this going to be productive? Will letting this go on a little bit be helpful and productive to the team? If so, I may let it go on a little bit. Or if it's not going to be productive, then I'm going to reframe things and redirect to a different place. Acknowledging any good behaviors. This is not just bad things, but acknowledging good behaviors, such as when the parties are listening to each other, or any good behavior that you see, being able, or when they've been able to reach some small agreements, acknowledging that. And then finally, giving the parties hope when they make any progress. Those are some things that we could expand a lot, but some techniques that facilitators can use to de-escalate conflict. Okay, here's what I'm going to do now. Let's see. So that's a brief overview. Went a little bit longer, but we actually have an hour and a half. So now there's a little bit of time still left here. I've got some questions here. Just in wrapping this up, you may have a question that you want to ask, and if you do, you can type it right into the Q&A. But something to be thinking about, what part maybe of this webinar, because you didn't go to the full training, but what do you think maybe was of most value to you today? What questions do you have that remain unanswered? And then a couple, this third and fourth are really important. Do you see the need? And this isn't a leading question. I'm really interested in your thoughts here. Do you see the need for possibly designated and trained IEP facilitators within your district? And is this training something you think your district might be interested in? And then maybe that's not something your district is interested in. I got a lot of feedback from the training we did with the odds executive committee members and State Department personnel. And part of the feedback was that there might also be others in the district, maybe administrators, principals, other staff who just happen to, part of their role involves facilitating difficult meetings, maybe not IEP team meetings, but difficult meetings as part of their job that might benefit from learning these tools and getting this facilitator training. So it might be that you see a need for this within your district, and maybe your district would be interested in this. We're looking at possibly rolling this training out in the fall and the spring to districts that would want this, but it may be also your district would be interested in it, not to train specifically identified individuals to facilitate difficult meetings within the district, but maybe just to help build, strengthen capacity at the local level for dealing with difficult meetings through learning these skills. And then I just mentioned to you that before we leave, or when we leave, there'll be a short survey that, please complete that. But let me ask you right now, before we go, any questions that you might have. Are there any questions that I could address while we're together? And by the way, if you don't have an answer to those questions that we just looked at, that I asked you to think about regarding whether this might be helpful in your district, or whether just to have the specifically identified people, or whether you just think learning these skills and techniques and such that are part of this training would benefit. If you don't have that today, that's absolutely fine. You could always reach out to me, rob.keiter@okstate.edu. I would love to know your thoughts. I would love to see if you have any questions even after today. But what I am going to do right now is just address any questions you might have. There's just a few of you that are with me today. So if you have any questions, I'm looking to see right now. If you do, let me also see if there's anything maybe in the chat. I don't see anything there. So any questions? Does anyone have any questions regarding what I've been sharing with you today during the webinar? If so, I'm going to answer those. Give you just a moment. I don't see any questions right now, and that's fine. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. But as I said, when this is over, you think about this later on. If you do have any questions, you have any thoughts, or you're interested in this training, please reach out to me and let me know. And also, if you're interested in us providing any service for you, whether it's mediation or whether it's IEP facilitation, please reach out to us, because we want to serve you. Our mission is helping families and schools resolve disputes at the earliest stage possible. Well, I want to thank, I don't see any questions, so I want to thank everyone for staying with me and staying through this entire presentation. I did it as quick as I could without running, but at least to give you the big points of this, and then just simply say that, please complete that survey afterwards, and let us know how we can assist you, any way that we can assist you in the future. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.